Wonderful. Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. It is good to sit at this virtual table while standing symbolically in solidarity alongside my partners at the Center for Community Resilience, Casa Mirna, EBA, and We Are Better Together, to discuss a deeply important issue and one that I've worked on and sought to address throughout my time in public service: the crisis of childhood trauma. Since the onset of this pandemic, we have grieved immense personal and collective loss, and our children are no exception. Like many of us, they have shouldered an unprecedented emotional burden year after a year of uncertainty and grief. The hours, days, and weeks of fear, stress, and anxiety are imprinted on their bodies. We bring it to the work. Our children bring it to school. It impacts every aspect of their lives. And these mental and emotional health challenges have been exacerbated, not only by the pandemic and its economic consequences, but by the endless and persistent threat of white supremacist violence, police brutality, and systemic racism. But make no mistake, trauma is not a new experience for many vulnerable communities who have been dealing with disproportionate hurt for generations. Our children of color, queer, transgender, and immigrant youth living in poverty have experienced high levels of traumatic stress leading to long-term physical and mental health problems. That's why, as a member of the Boston City Council, I created the Committee on Healthy Women, Families, and Communities to reduce the systemic roots of trauma, to prevent violence, and to center those issues disproportionately impacting people of color, women, and girls. And during my first term in Congress, in partnership with the late Chairman Elijah Cummings, I was proud to host the first ever congressional hearing dedicated to the issue of childhood trauma. The testimony from that hearing is what informed the Strong Support for Children Act, which we are proudly reintroducing today in the 117th Congress. Because in this moment of layered and intersecting trauma, we must make every effort possible to support, to protect the mental and emotional well-being of our communities, especially our children. So what does that mean? It means pursuing precise, intentional, healing-based policies that address the crises that often trigger childhood trauma, like poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, and a lack of culturally competent healthcare. The Strong Support for Children Act, which was crafted in close partnership with many of the advocates that are here today, would do just that. It is bold, comprehensive legislation which takes a holistic approach to addressing the growing crisis of childhood trauma. Our bill would disrupt cycles of intergenerational trauma by providing resources for young people to access the culturally competent, community-based care and resources that they need to heal and to thrive. It would create new funding streams through state and local public health departments and give resources directly to experts on the ground. These funds can be used to develop culturally competent strategies and provide resources such as economic support, housing, and food to families to address the root causes of trauma. Because every child should have their most basic needs met. They deserve to grow up with nutritious food on the table, stable housing, equal protections, a good education, and resources to tend to their mental health. Before I close, I will share that for me, this work is deeply personal. I've experienced the destabilizing factors growing up in a single parent household with an incarcerated parent, a parent who couldn't access the kind of treatment he needed to become sober. And I've experienced the trauma of bullying and discrimination for being an unapologetic Black woman. And as many of you know, I'm also a survivor of a near decade of childhood sexual abuse as well. So all of these intersecting traumas and experiences I carried with me as a child, and certainly carried them not only as I navigated community, but in crossing the threshold, entering into learning communities every day. From my experience and decades of work with communities in the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, which I'm very humbled and honored to represent, I know all too well how the failings of government in our systems play in perpetuating this trauma. So as we begin to recover from these overlapping crises, we must ensure that our recovery is one that is just and that is equitable. And most importantly, that it is trauma informed and that it leaves no one behind. Thank you once again to all of our advocates for joining us today. The Chairwoman, Carolyn Maloney of the Oversight Committee, for her partnership on this bill. And I look forward to discussing this critical issue and our shared vision toward a healing and trauma-informed recovery. With that, I'll now pass the virtual mic over to Dr. Wendy Ellis, Director of Community Resilience at the George Washington University's Redstone Center for Prevention and Wellness, who my office worked with very closely in crafting this legislation. Dr. Ellis?
Thank you so much, Representative Pressley. The Center for Community Resilience is absolutely elated to see the Strong Support for Children Act reintroduce this Congress. This legislation takes action to address the social, economic, and environmental origins of child abuse and neglect, and seeks to mitigate the onset of childhood trauma within communities. We would like to thank Representative Pressley for her leadership on taking a far-reaching and comprehensive approach to reducing childhood trauma through the context of adverse community environments, which is integral to building resilience and strengthening support structures to reduce rates of child maltreatment. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating effects on children's mental health, we need to implement an innovative and data-driven approach to work collaboratively with local health departments to identify the root causes of child abuse and trauma and develop preventive measures for the future. The Strong Support for Children Act represents the most comprehensive federal public health response to address this crisis and takes a systematic approach through data analysis and predictive modeling to pinpoint specific drivers of adversity within communities. We can no longer ignore the impact of structural racism on health outcomes. As seen in the last year alone, racial inequities are pronounced and pervasive in the healthcare space, and systemic racism has even been identified as a persistent adverse childhood experience that drives negative outcomes intentionally and reliably from generation to generation. Representative Pressley's bill has a key differentiator in addressing childhood trauma through the use of system dynamic modeling to identify and implement targeted policy solutions based on community input. Through this bill, we are not merely speaking to the coordination of comprehensive services, but we are drilling down to identify how inequities manifest throughout the community and where we can get to the root cause of it through policy intervention. The predictive modeling in this bill allows for local health departments to elevate community voice at the center of change, build shared understanding among stakeholders, and identify key policy levers to support the process of systemic change. Through Representative Pressley's bill, the Department of Health and Human Services will fund 2 new grant programs to support local public health departments, which will be used to improve connections through care coordination, align community initiatives in targeted areas of need, and expand community capacity through cross-sector collaboration. For example, the Care Coordination Grant Program will support up to 40 health departments across the United States to train providers on trauma-informed care strategies and strengthen the coordination of the existing network of programs and services, such as violence prevention programs and foster youth transitioning programs. As organizations and leaders grapple with the short-term and long-term public health and economic challenges resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, there remains severe consequences of the pandemic on family functioning, including child maltreatment. This bill provides the missing link to prepare for an equitable recovery. Childhood trauma is a pervasive public health issue, even further exacerbated by the collective trauma of the past year. Therefore, we thank Representative Pressley for her continued prioritization on healing, and we advise Congress to move swiftly on this legislation. Here at the Center for Community Resilience, we believe that all communities should have the ability to not just bounce back, but to bounce forward and thrive. In order for the U.S. to press forward in an equitable recovery, post-pandemic, trauma-informed policies, especially for children and youth, will be instrumental in creating the healing necessary for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for practicing cooperative governing and being a co-author in the drafting of this legislation. And now we will hear from, I think you're up, Stephanie. Stephanie Brown from Casa Mirna.
Hi, thank you, Congresswoman Pressley, for inviting me to speak in support of the Strong Support for Children Act today. At Casa Mirna, we believe every relationship should be safe and healthy. We're a domestic violence program in Boston that supports over 2,000 survivors every year, the vast majority of whom are from Black and Latinx and immigrant communities. Domestic violence does not discriminate. It occurs at the same rate in families, regardless of their zip code, their race and ethnicity, their education, or their income bracket. But intergenerational trauma and lack of resources rooted in structural inequality directly impact the remedies that survivors have to escape or to stop the abuse. Survivors and their children from Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant communities do not have access to resources to help them get safe. Community trauma and domestic violence are inextricably entwined. Because of structural inequalities and racism within our institutions and society, survivors of color are forced to choose between living with abuse and homelessness, between living with abuse and being able to feed their children, between living with abuse and the instability of poverty. Those are choices that no parent should ever have to make on behalf of themselves or their children. The effects of domestic violence are exacerbated directly by white supremacy culture and the racist systems in which we all engage. The survivors with whom we work are not just dealing with abuse. Abuse might just be one of the traumas they face. At the same time, they have to deal with poverty, lack of appropriate health care, overcrowded schools, a criminal legal system that they can't trust to protect them, family separation, the threat of deportation, and the looming threat of homelessness. And yet, our current systems force families to separate their needs into silos. The Strong Support for Children Act would bring these vital resources to communities for addressing the root causes of childhood trauma, including poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, and discrimination. Because these resources would be neighborhood and community-based, they'd be coordinated and culturally specific, they'll view each family as a whole entity and work to meet their needs holistically. Families won't have to choose between dealing with food insecurity separately from homelessness, separately from healthcare. They won't have to be afraid to talk about abuse in their household for fear of losing their housing, or for being stigmatized in school, or for fear of their healthcare provider not knowing how to respond to symptoms of domestic violence appropriately. Funds would be used to develop culturally specific strategies to provide resources to families directly. Resources that everyone in this country should have a right to expect. Economic opportunity, housing, food, and healthcare are all things that address the root causes of intergenerational trauma. These are basic human rights that no child should have to live without. So through the Strong Support for Children Act, families will have their basic needs met, children and families will be healthier and more resilient, and our communities will heal and flourish. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And, I look forward to our being in community together again. I missed being together for the annual breakfast. And of course, I've been an MC and a co-host of that breakfast and shared my family's own experiences with intergenerational violence. And I know just how critical Casa Mirna services are. You are a beacon of hope and a lifeline to so many. And I thank you for joining us today, and again, for your partnership in advancing this legislation. And we know that we've seen an uptick, an increase in domestic violence during the pandemic. So you have been on the front lines, and we thank you for everything you're doing to support survivors in their healing and their families. And so we thank you, Stephanie, and now we'll hear from Ruth Rollins, a dear sister friend of mine who is the co-founder of We Are Better Together, a nonprofit based in Boston that connects and heals women and girls affected by homicide and incarceration. Ruth?
Thank you, Representative Ayanna. So I just wanted to start off by just thanking you for the invite to be here, and it's just a well-needed conversation. I'm always a little nervous, but so my name is Ruth Reynolds. I am the founder and executive director of We Are Better Together, Warren Daniel Harrison Project. And I am just so grateful that you're bringing this, bill forward, Ayanna. We Are Better Together, Warren Daniel Harrison is a program that was named after my son that works with mothers, families that are impacted by incarceration and community harm. The program was built based on my personal loss. So when we talk about trauma in this act, that I think it's so well needed in our community with the overlay of trauma and how children are impacted through domestic violence, through community harm, through incarceration. And one of the things that we see in our organization, it's about 60 women that work together. Primarily, some of them have lost their children due to homicide. Some of them have lost their children due to incarceration. But in my particular case, I have been impacted on both ends. And 7 years ago, when I came out and told my story, it wasn't the norm. But unfortunately, 7 years forward, I would say 70% of our community is impacted through incarceration or homicide. So we have a lot of women that are raising their grandchildren based on the loss of their children, whether it's homicide, incarceration. And this bill would really support them in regards to cultural competence services in place, supporting them with getting them the needs that they need for their children, because what we're seeing is how the cycle continues with untreated trauma with the young children. And a lot of these children are just recycling through our community because there are not services in place. So I believe this bill would really support the need of our community, our Black and Brown community, in regards to the services and the need that they would need. So, so, I mean, I can go on and on and on, just reading the bill and just seeing firsthand our agency is impact directly. We have these women that are raising these grandchildren that are not getting the services they need. And it becomes the prison to pipeline, and before you know it. But I believe with this, with this bill, that if we can meet them at a young age, we can intercept, and break that cycle of violence for the next generation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Should never be nervous because you are an expert. And so we thank you for lending your expertise to the movement and to this virtual table. And I know you have much more to say, and you can save that for the Q&A, Ruth, okay? So we thank you, Ruth. And up next is Myra Negron Roche, COO at EBA, an organization that offers affordable housing and supportive programming to increase social and economic mobility for low-income families that have been displaced by urban development. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Congresswoman Pressley, for creating this space today and for your leadership. My name is Myra Negron Roche. I am the Chief Operating Officer of EVA, a community development corporation in the South End in Boston. EVA is one of the first Latino community-based nonprofit organization to independently develop and integrate affordable housing with a comprehensive, culturally responsive, and bilingual programming to provide low-income residents with the opportunity to reach their full potential through innovative programming offerings. Over the past 50 years, EVA has been a leader to empower and engage individuals and families to improve their life through high quality housing, education, and arts programming. EVA currently have 667 affordable housing units and 5 programs, from a preschool program, youth development program, financial empowerment, resident services and engagement, and arts programming. Our approach to community development and social determinants of health is as basic to help our family to cover their basic needs from their earliest stages of life throughout the entire life cycle, connecting families with resources, providing case management, financial coaching, and support their families for their well-being. We support the Strong for Children's Act, because that not only gonna further our work at EVA, but we see firsthand how our children at our preschool unprecedented emotional burden, particularly after the year of the pandemic, where we, give me 1 second, I think my internet is unstable, so I'm gonna put my video on where have lost faith. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're breaking up there a little bit. Okay, so let's see. Continue, please.
Excellent. So we see that mental health challenges in our families and children, such as anxiety, depression, is not only exacerbated by the pandemic, but is also through the economic consequences that we have suffering. But we will be persistently we are currently persistently treated by white supremacy violence, policing brutally, and systematic racism. That is why it's so important that we must make every single effort to support and protect the mental and emotional well-being of our families, community, and especially our children. That means that pursuing holistic policy like this one to address this important crisis in our community. We support the strong support of the Children's Act would disturb circle of intergenerational trauma and providing resources to young people to access the cultural competent, community-based care and resources that they need to heal and strive and live a better life. We all know that every single family should have their basic needs met, and that including a free, high quality mental health care. This bill is critical to step forward to ensure that every children has the support they need, diverse and addressing inequality and having a strong quality of life. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting us. And thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your leadership and for the work that you do for all of us. We can do this by ourselves. It will be a massive underestimating that we can do this by ourselves. You are an important role in our community and we support this bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you for your leadership and your partnership on this and so many other social justice and public health issues. Of course, housing is public health. It is a critical determinant. So we thank you for all that you do and for joining us today. And finally, we'll hear from Keon Sprinkle of Roxbury, who is a formerly incarcerated community member who was recently exonerated. He is a survivor
Wow.
in every sense of the word. Keon.
How you doing? I agree with your husband. So I first want to just say thank you to all the women who spoke before me. Y'all was very eloquent and inspiring, to see y'all taking charge. I was a chairman and a member of a program inside that we're trying to bring out here called the African American Cultural Coalition, and it's also the African Heritage Coalition. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to get different guys that was inside of all different age groups and pull them together so that we can have a conversation and figure out what the gap was. after that, we wanted to start contacting people on the outside who can actually connect back with us to let us, to see what our worth is. And, with that being said, it's important for us to be able to work with individuals like y'all. And your bill helps so much. And we actually endorsed you from inside because we just believe in you. And I believe in you. And I've been watching what you've been doing. And I'm very grateful for it. It's just hard. It's a lot of trauma that we never talk about. And as the conversation progresses, I can talk about different things because everything that these women says affects me all the way. And this bill will save a lot of lives, I believe.
Thank you, Kia. Thank you. All right. Well, I think we're going to transition now into Q&A. Ricardo?
That's right. Thanks, everyone. So we will now move to questions from the media on the line. I do just want to reiterate, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function in Zoom. We'll call on you. You can find the raise hand function under reactions or the participants panel at the bottom of the screen. So any questions?
Well, that's rare, y'all. I guess we really said it all. You all did such an excellent job at speaking to the merits of the legislation and why it's needed. But we'll give folks another minute. Well, while we're waiting, I'll just add that this moment, I feel, I was saying offline and now I'll say on the record, my heart is very full because as sobering as it is, just how pervasive and systemic and intersectional the trauma is, I'm encouraged because, Dr. Ellis, I don't know what your experience has been, but I can attest for probably many of those here within my district. When I ran for the Boston City Council in 2009 and was asked what would I do about the achievement gap, and I said, mitigate and combat trauma. And people, it's not, I'm not being dramatic to say I was laughed out of rooms. And there were even some in our home community who felt that I was encouraging a coddling of our children because people were stereotyping and limiting who in fact was impacted by childhood trauma. So the fact that here we are today, where this is now a part of the daily sort of, discourse, that there is at least acknowledgement of this as the true public health crisis that it is, that you can use terminology like the ACEs and people know what that is really a testament to every single person, on this call. And not only is this a public health issue, but it does have far-reaching implications for generations. I do think Frederick Douglass said it best when he said it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men and women. And, and that is really the point here. And there's also an adage that says the best gift you can give a child is a stable adult. And we know that the adults in their lives have been destabilized because of this pandemic, because of the economic hardship that it has wrought. But even well before that, all of these things have been heightened in the last year, both white supremacist acts of violence, police brutality, but poverty, food insecurity, mass incarceration, gentrification, displacement, being unhoused. exposure to domestic violence, gun violence, being surviving family members of loved ones of homicide. These are all things that minoritized, marginalized, and vulnerable communities have already been dealing with. So I know that the work ahead of us is large in scope, but I'm encouraged that we are finally having the conversation. And in fact, I did send a letter to the Biden-Harris administration urging them to host a White House summit on how to combat childhood trauma and to bring us all together to discuss how to advance community-based solutions to healing. This recovery must be one that is trauma-informed. And that requires infrastructure. So what is infrastructure? Investment. And that's exactly why we're reintroducing this bill. And the reason why we're empowering our public health departments, our local public health departments, is because, they work closely with the organizations on the ground. So, I could go on and on. This is just an incredibly emotional and full circle moment, for me. And it is one of the things that I'm proudest of, having convened that first ever congressional hearing on childhood trauma. And many colleagues said that it was the most important and impactful hearing that they have been in for 10 or 15 years. And several of them went on to host their own public hearings in their districts on childhood trauma. I'll just end here by saying that one of the other things that I appreciate about the bill, and we keep saying it's comprehensive and it's robust, is because it acknowledges that our children are not independent contractors. They belong to families who belong to whole communities. And so, we can make these investments for all the things that we all fight for. And I've introduced other bills for like counseling, not criminalization, and the End Pushout Act, to make those investments in those socio-emotional wellness supports that not only supports the wholeness and the health of our students, but their readiness to learn as well. But if they go home and all of that is undone because they're returning to a household that is, rife with destabilizing factors, then the work is undone. So the thing that I really appreciate about the bill is that it is it outlines a way with which to make those investments to address those root causes of trauma. And that does mean stabilizing the entire family. So I don't know if there's more that folks want to, offer in that regard, but I'm just immensely grateful for each and every one of you.
I just want to applaud you also for wanting to lift up not just the problem, but the solutions that stand right in front of us. This bill does a very effective job of looking at not just thinking about the trauma-informed care, but let's use the data in a smart way to help us to lift up the community voice as well as the solutions. And when we talk about resilience, and when we talk about the pervasiveness of ACEs as an American public health issue, it's because it's not just happening to certain people. It's happening to all of us. But the difference is what is in place for individuals to bounce back, and also the intentionality behind the adversity that individuals are experiencing generation after generation after generation. The intentionality of that, and also the predictability of it. When we can look at specific zip codes and predict what's happening to individuals just merely because of where they live, that speaks to the systemic piece of this. And so, I myself, I'm a survivor of ACEs. I have a score of 8. And if you go by the science, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be able to put together a sentence, let alone have a doctorate degree and hold the work in place that I do. But it's because I had access to quality education, because I had access to a stable household with grandparents who were able to put food on the table, never had to worry about having day-to-day necessities. Those are the things that we know. The science already shows us what helps individuals bounce back, what prevents ACEs in the first place, and what gives our children the equitable opportunity to move forward and thrive. We don't need to study that any longer. And this bill actually helps us to get to those root causes, the intentionality behind that, correct those policies, and put those supports in place so that we are both preventing and we're giving our children the opportunity that they well deserve to be able to thrive. So thank you.
Absolutely, doctor. No, thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I just want to say I appreciate your vision in this bill and the expectation that we all work together as well to heal communities, because I think we all have our silos and our specific niches, and I can support, thousands of domestic violence survivors and help them obtain housing, but that's not solving the problem. And I think your expectation through this bill that we all work together and that government works in support with all of us is what it's going to take as well, because we can't do this by ourselves. I mean, like Keon said, he was trying to do this work on the inside, but wanted to bring it out to connect to other people. And I think that's it. Sometimes, unfortunately, we need the push, and we need legislation to almost force us to do that. And I think this is an opportunity, to make that happen. And so I just really appreciate that. And I just recognize that we're in this together, and we have to figure this out together, or we're not gonna, we may have some improvements, but nothing is going to be lasting and impactful.
That's right. And to thank you, Stephanie, and to Dr. Ellis's point, we know what works. So it's really just about our commitment to investing in it. But I am also very passionate about data. I do think that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So we do always want to lift up the importance of that data collection. And Keon, you spoke about just the many layers of trauma. I was alluding to my father. My father battled an opioid addiction, a substance use disorder for a number of decades, and it had everything to do with the childhood traumas that he was self-medicating from. And rather than his disease being prioritized, as a disease, he was criminalized. But he will tell you that he was self-medicating from a lifetime of childhood traumas, growing up in the foster care system, losing both of his parents early, being the eldest of 6 children, and feeling a great deal of responsibility for them. So
I will say, for me, as a lot of people don't know, I was tried and convicted at 17. I was convicted at 19 for a crime I didn't commit, right? But the backstory to that is like, I come up in a household with watching my mother be destroyed by my father, like destroyed, and beat to the point that she decided she's done with men, she moved on to women. I also was kidnapped with her and had to watch her be raped. So, there's so much trauma that was going on in my brain as I was growing up. As a child, I was angry, very angry, and it's like, sometimes these kids look at each other and be like, yo, what you looking at? And stuff like that. And I had seen a Jay-Z interview and he said something which was true. It's like, we fighting over things like what you looking at, because it's like, do you know what's happening in my household? So why you looking at me like that? And things like that just make it worse. I was in prison and I watched men that I knew since kids that we had all these plans about. Some of us was going to be like business owners. Some people was going to be cops. The basic things. Now it's like, oh, he was out for 2 years. He had a good run. Right. And it's like, huh? Good run. Like, you supposed to be home. Right. But the majority of my friends been going to DYS since 11, 12, 13. There were some households where you go in a house and in the refrigerator, there's nothing in there but water. And then right next door, they got everything in there. So, this kid is going to be willing to do certain things to get that others don't. I had to be raised with my grandmother. She was culturally not there. So she doesn't understand what I'm doing as a kid like my mom would be able to. So when these women are talking about these different things with their programs, it just is touching me. Ruth, what she's doing is remarkable, because she's able to, if she had the funding, all these people had the funding, like you said, just to get it out there. You don't even need, just so that people see a flyer and they know it exists. I would have knew that there was help for people to talk to me and help me understand the feelings that I was feeling now, so that I knew how, when I went to prison, not to act like I had to be tough and to tell my mom or my grandmother before she passed away, I need help. And mental health isn't a bad thing. Like, so the more funding that we can get to these topics, the more it can just be talked about, so that some kid can know that there's an option. And that's what's important.
Keon, thank you so much. And thank you. I've struggled because I say the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing the policymaking. And I've seen, many times people's traumas, and Ruth, I know you have too, be exploited. And I hate that folks have to weaponize their trauma in order to be seen and to be heard. And so, we want you to feel empowered in that self-agency to then, be a part of the solution in a meaningful way. And you're doing that today. And, but every time you have to share those things, I know it doesn't make it any easier. So just thank you for doing that. But what you illustrated right there about the child that is hungry and knows that next door they have food, and then, doing something to survive, that's the point. Everyone's basic needs deserve to be met. And if we're not going to meet people's needs and then they do things merely to survive, and then you criminalize that behavior, that is exactly how the cycle repeats, So it is about one ecosystem and the investments that we make, again, that to support everyone in healing and in thriving. So I think, we've said it all, at least for now. And I hope that you'll continue to amplify the merits of the bill, and also to join us in lobbying this administration to have a trauma-informed recovery, which includes passage of things like the Strong Support for Children Act, but also having a White House summit. I think it is important enough that it rises to that level. Ricardo?
All right. Well, with that, we'll conclude today's press conference. We will be sending out a press release shortly with all of the relevant information and details on the legislation. But if folks have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me at ricardo.sanchez@mail.house.gov. But really, just thank you so much to everyone for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.